Joining us now is Dərmər, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs. It's good to have you with us this morning. You advised the Prime Minister back in March not to proceed here. I know your role in many ways was to drum up to support, to find the consensus here. Didn't seem to be there. You're the National Security Advisor among those advising against it. Why do you believe the Prime Minister didn't listen to you here?
Well, I don't think he didn't listen to me. We tried, the Prime Minister tried and authorized me to go into discussions with the Israeli president and members of the opposition to try to reach consensus and compromise. Unfortunately, those talks did not bear fruit. And so what the Prime Minister decided to do, he can't give a veto power to the political opposition of any step forward in judicial reform. So what he decided to do was to choose the least controversial subject, which is what passed just the other day, this sort of reasonableness standard, which the judges in Israel have used to strike down all sorts of decisions made by both the executive and the legislative branch. And that was this issue of the reasonableness clause was something that members of the opposition had supported reforming in the past. So he took the least controversial issue and he said, we're going to move forward in a measured way with the least controversial aspect of this reform. And after that is passed, he called on the opposition to now sit down at the table to get serious about finding a compromise. That's what he said yesterday. He's given 4 months now in order to find that compromise. And believe me, Erica, if we can't get to a compromise in 4 months, we won't be able to get to a compromise in 4 years. The Prime Minister would like to do that. He would like to forge that consensus and make these reforms together with the opposition, which is rare in democracies. Usually that does not happen. Well, where the people that were elected turned to the other side and said, let's do these reforms together.
So we'll see what happens in that 4 months. But as you know, I mean, you talked directly about this clause. There is no constitution in Israel. This was the one form of check and balance, right? Was the Supreme Court being able to say, hey, this doesn't work to the legislative and executive branch. That is now gone. That is what a major part of the concern was, not just in the country, but outside of the country as well. We heard it from the president here. I'm curious, did President Biden directly ask the Prime Minister to stop down on this legislation?
No. And let me also just clarify something. There are many checks that the Supreme Court has on the executive and legislative branches in government that maybe a lot of people are not aware of. There's all check and no balance. That's the problem that we've had in Israel over the last 30 years. You've had one of the most activist judiciaries in the world. We used to have 3 very strong branches of government, and today we have a very big judicial branch of government and 2 twigs, the executive and legislative branch. And the focus of this reform is to try to restore the balance between the branches of government. On what was passed yesterday, it's important for you and your listeners to understand. There are many checks that the Supreme Court has on executive decisions and legislative branch decisions in Israel. The reasonableness standard was one of the arrows in the quiver of the judiciary. The problem with that standard is entirely subjective. You're basically substituting the views of 15 in Israel unelected judges for the views of the 120 members of the Israeli parliament or the government. And it's an entirely subjective standard that doesn't exist to this extent in any Western democracy. The British have a very narrow standard where they only use arbitrary and capricious.
So speaking of the British, I will point out the foreign minister saying that urging the country this morning to preserve its system of checks and balances. You talk about what you see as these limited voices. Let's talk about the voices who are very vocal, not just last night into today, but for months, who have been concerned about this potential legislation. And certainly after it passed, we see the protests. You have the Medical Association on a 24-hour strike. We have the thousands of reservists who say they will not report for duty. Nearly all former IDF chiefs of staff, as well as security officials, are concerned about this. Why rush this at this point, given all of these concerns, both domestically and internationally?
Well, I don't agree that it was rushed. I mean, it took a couple of months to pass the most minor part of the reform. We've been dealing with this thing for 7 months. The Prime Minister just said we're going to give another 4 months for compromise. Look, Erica, Israel's a democracy. And as you know, in all democracies around the world, when you have issues that are controversial issues, you have protesters on the other side. You saw it in France, you see it in the United States, you see it in democracies around the world. All it means is that Israel's democracy is very vibrant. I think there are fears that the opposition and many of the protesters have. I personally think those fears are unfounded, and I think they're going to see, as we move forward with this reform, that many of the concerns that they have are not going to happen. all of the fears that they have of what this reform is going to do, it's going to somehow be the end of Israeli democracy. They're going to realize, no, it's going to strengthen Israeli democracy. Israel has been a democracy, is a democracy, will continue to be a democracy. We just have a judicial system, again, I will say it, that is the most activist in the world. You have issues right now in a clearly defined system in the United States where you have an executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and you have tension between your branches of government, between the executive branch and the judicial branch.
Let me ask you, because we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you those.
We just have to restore the balance.
Specifically in Israel, if the Supreme Court does in fact strike down this legislation, will the government heed that ruling?
Well, listen, Israel's run by the rule of law. I have no idea whether or not the Supreme Court would make such a decision. It would seem to me a very strange decision for the Supreme Court to make. To put it in American terms, imagine that
would you? But we're almost out of time, sir. So would the government heed that ruling? Yes or no?
The government will always obey and abide by the rule of law in Israel because we have in Israel the rule of law. What we don't have is the rule of judges. We have the rule of law.
Ron Dermer, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.